Welcome to Houston House at South by Southwest. The energy transition is a transformational force with a technology-based switch from fossil fuels to low-carbon fuels at its heart. Investment in the transition is well underway, with daily news reports announcing new projects for wind, solar, hydrogen, bio-based fuels, and carbon capture and storage. While the large energy corporates are scaling technologies that run smarter and more efficiently, it is innovative startups that are developing the innovations that will truly change the world. Join founders from some of the world's most promising energy tech startups to discuss the critical role technology plays in accelerating the global energy transition.
I'm Jane Stricker, and I'm the Executive Director of the Houston Energy Transition Initiative, a part of the Greater Houston Partnership. And I'm joined by truly some of the coolest folks in startup tech today. And I'm fortunate enough to work with them in Houston, where there is just so much happening, and that's what we're going to talk about today. We'll get into conversation around what's happening in the climate tech startup space, energy transition, and how tech, particularly in and around Houston, is really driving that forward. So I'm really excited to be here. I just joined the partnership in the beginning of the year. I spent, before that, 21 years with BP, where I worked in a broad range of industry activities and supported a study on carbon capture, use, and storage. I'm going to introduce my panelists here, and then we'll get the conversation started. I want to introduce Trevor Best from Syzygy Plasmonics. I first met Trevor the day Greentown Labs opened in Houston, and we were both asked to speak at that event, and I had never met anybody with so much enthusiasm for the transition, so it's great to have him here. We also have Moji Karimi from Cemvita factory. I'd never heard the term applied biology and energy transition in the same context until I met Moji, so I'm really excited about what he has to talk about. And then Federico Marques, who has Moonflower Technologies. He opened what was probably one of my favorite restaurants in Houston, Ruggles Green, and he now has a hyper-local, closed-loop hydroponic urban vertical farm in Houston, and is doing amazing work around food circularity. So I'm going to hand it off to them to give you a little bit more of their backgrounds, but I got to tell you, I feel like I'm at the coolest conversation in South by Southwest this week, because these are just amazing things that are happening. So, Federico?
Oh, yes. Pleasure to meet you. Just wanted to give you a little background. Yes, I never expected to be in the restaurant industry. It was kind of a fluke. I used to work for Bayer. I did a lot of work as an intern at NASA back in the early 90s, and then I worked at Bayer, had a really good career at Bayer. But really the focus there was energy and innovation. How can we do more with less? Because the energy prices were going up and things were getting a little bit crazy. So that's sort of how I got my foothold. And NASA is in Houston, so they were a really good resource for me to reach out to, and they had a lot of different technical work that they had done as far as energy efficiency. So it was just sort of unusual that I would come back to Houston and become a restaurateur by accident. But it worked out, and we did very well. And now with the hydroponic farm, we're also learning a lot about doing more with less energy, less water, less resources. So that's one of the key things I've really been focused on. And I know this is the era of energy abundance, but if you can do more with less, that's the main thing I like to focus on. So a little background.
Thanks, Federico. Moji?
Yes, thank you for the introduction. So, our company started with the kind of a crazy idea, and that was if we could engineer microbes to eat CO2 instead of sugar. And we did that, and, the first client that we found asked if we could make bioethylene, from CO2. And bioethylene is the biggest organic molecule in the world, so it goes into all polymers and plastics. And my co-founder, who's also my sister, found out that bananas in the ripening process make ethylene. So, she took the gene for ethylene forming enzyme from a banana, engineered it into a microbe that was eating CO2, and now, it could make bioethylene from CO2. That was the initial crazy idea. Then we expanded from that into using microbes for all kind of industry applications for energy transition, a lot of carbon negative solutions, anything from getting microbes to make sustainable aviation fuels to renewable natural gas, microbes as small mining machines for better extraction of energy transition metals like copper for electricity and lithium for batteries, and all the way to building subsurface chemical plants that basically turn the reservoir into kind of a natural bioreactor and use microbes in the subsurface for production of things like biohydrogen. So like Jane said, we're the kind of Venn diagram of synthetic biology or industrial biotechnology and energy transition, and couldn't think of a better place than Houston to do this, because on one hand we have the legacy of the oil and gas industry and a lot of chemical process engineers, and then we have the biggest medical center in the world. So a lot of those skill sets for microbiology, molecular biology, they're all easily transferable for this industry application. So happy to be here and tell you more about what we're doing, and hear your feedback as well.
Yeah, so at Syzygy Plasmonics, what we are doing is we are making a completely new type of chemical reactor. So traditionally, chemical reactors at refineries or chemical plants, they are powered by heat that comes from burning fuel. Our reactor is different. It is powered by light that comes from LEDs, which can be driven by renewable electricity. And instead of telling you about it, I'd like to show you. For the first time in public, we're actually going to show our reactor here at South by Southwest. So cool. This is one of Syzygy's chemical reactors right here. You can see the LED light core in the middle. We pack our special photocatalyst inside the glass cells, which are empty right now, and you can see the aluminum shell on the outside. This chemical reactor completely eliminates the need to burn fuel and completely eliminates the need for combustion in chemistry, and thereby eliminates all of the emissions associated with powering chemical reactions. What is truly amazing about this technology here is that it is a platform technology. We have demonstrated this for more than a dozen different chemical reactions. We're bringing 2 to market next year. The first is zero emission hydrogen production, and the second is a reaction where we're actually taking CO2 and turning it back into value-added products like synthetic fuels, carbon neutral synthetic fuels. So, very cool. And another thing I'd like to say is that all of this is happening right next door in Houston, Texas. So if you're a climate tech VC and you're looking for things to invest in, if you aren't looking at Houston, then you're about to miss out on something big. Really fantastic to be up here with these great panelists.
Thanks, Trevor. It is interesting because historically we've thought about Houston as being strictly the energy and gas capital. And more we're seeing it convert into the energy transition capital. Last week was CERA Week, and it's one of the biggest energy conferences. And having spent a few days over there, there's the traditional CERA Week side where all the sort of conference panels happen. And then there's the Innovation Agora side where sort of the new concepts and a lot of the new activity gets discussed. And the level of activity that was happening last week over in the Agora side, I think was probably much more dynamic and interesting than what was happening sort of in the traditional energy side. And I think that's really become the way things are moving in and around Houston right now. And I'd love to start with Trevor. Your background was Baker Hughes, traditional energy. And what was it that really drove you in this direction of energy transition, and then why Houston?
Yeah, so what drove me into the energy transition, there's really kind of 2 things. Going back to early mid last decade, you start seeing increasing awareness of climate change, what's happening in the world, and I wanted to be on the right side of history. So about the middle of last decade, my co-founder, Dr. Suman Kadiwada, and I started looking for a novel technology that could have a massive positive impact in humanity's fight on climate change. In that, there's also a financial aspect, and we started looking at the writing on the wall. Around the middle of last decade, you started seeing some really interesting signals where renewables were getting more investment than traditional conventional energy, and combining the desire, wanting to do good, with writing on the wall for where industry's going, really drove us to make the jump and start developing this technology here. And then why Houston? There's a lot of reasons. Houston already is the energy capital of the world. It makes sense that the energy transition would stem from our city. Not only that, the talent. There's an absolutely amazing talent pool. We have never struggled to get electrical, chemical, mechanical engineers. And the kind of space that's available, lots of industrial space, lots of lab space that companies like ours can grow and scale into is really phenomenal. And finally, manufacturing base. So like everything that you just saw in there is made like 5 miles from our front door. And that's not something that happens in a lot of ecosystems. So it's just a convergence of a lot of really fantastic things that make Houston a great place to grow a company.
Awesome, thanks. Moji, what was your background and how did you end up in this space?
I also started in oil and gas, kind of not by choice. It was just, I didn't want to become a chemical or electrical engineer. That's just too hard. So petroleum engineering, where I grew up, made sense. And once I moved to US, that's what I did in one of the big service companies. And after a few years, realized, the big company thing is just not fast enough. And around that time, my sister was working in the Texas Heart Institute, working on, regenerating heart tissue and stem cell programming. And we just kind of started talking about that. And I was having this experience at a startup where we commercialized DNA sequencing in oil and gas, like looking at DNA of microbes in the subsurface, water, rock, kind of like building a 23andMe for the subsurface. And that company was based in San Diego. Our big investor was Illumina, the really big DNA sequencing company. So just kind of through these organic discussions with my sister, I said, I'm gaining some experience on commercialization side, a lot of biotech. What would make sense for us to do? And one area that she has spent a lot of time on, and she was writing a book for Springer, is biomimicry and nature-inspired technologies. And the one example that is like the most inspiring for her was photosynthesis. And how is it that nature for billions of years been able to use CO2 and turn that into basically everything that's around us? And is it about time for humans to learn how to replicate that, and engineer it and scale it and solve problems? So when I mentioned, using microbes to eat CO2, that was it. That was the starting point. And the way you do it is in a photobioreactor. But you start with CO2, water, sunlight, or artificial light, and you turn it into, sugar, or from sugar to everything else, pretty much. And that was kind of the starting point, going from that transition, in oil and gas to climate tech and energy. Funny bit in the middle was the first application. When we made the sugar from CO2, that sugar is pretty expensive, so it's not going to compete with bags of sugar, in Walmart. But the first application was for deep space exploration, to use the CO2 that astronauts breathe out, which is 1 kilogram per day per person. So 6 people in a vehicle, for a long time adds up. And turn that back into sugar, which then they could eat as a regenerative life support system. And then down the road on Mars, 96% of the air is already CO2. And NASA and SpaceX already have plans to use that and turn it into methane as the fuel for the way back. But what we wanted to do was to build a system that could use that CO2 and turn it into nutrients, so that you don't have to take all the food with you or just be limited to have to grow food in a space. So that foundation, once we showed that it is possible to use CO2 as a feedstock, around 2018, 19, really everything picked up with carbon capture, CCUS, energy transition, investments, more. And that's where we kind of made that pivot to, if you could make sugar, can we make other things from CO2? So we, started looking into gene databases, built that, what is possible. So we had a menu of 30 molecules. And when we talked to our first customer, that's when they picked bioethylene, and then that became the next project and kind of grown from there. So my point is sometimes it's like, people tell you, oh yeah, I always had this vision and I had this aha moment and just like, boom, here we are, I executed on that. But, it's like a collection of the small aha moments adding together and, getting here. But yeah, like I said, Houston is the best place for the type of talent that we need. And at the end of the day, that's where our customers are. If we want to solve climate change, we have to work with companies that are, creating the most emissions. And they want to, but you have to just give them the technology that makes sense. And when you think about what is synthetic biology doing across the board for, disrupting other industries, it is absolutely the best time to bring synthetic biology to climate change and energy tech for, chemical side, for, mining and metals and across the board new applications maybe we're not even thinking about. And I think Houston will be the best place to find the customers and the talent to make it happen.
Thanks, Moji. I think, the other piece that I want to hit on, and you mentioned it a bit, that we'll get into, and Federico will speak to, is the role of space exploration and how that fits in. But also, I think, climate change is not just about energy sources. It's also about sustainability more broadly. And I think, particularly Federico's work at Moonflower is really focused on how do we use less resources to create the same amount of product, particularly food, and doing it in a sustainable way that's local and creates better opportunity. And it addresses a number of different challenges related to the energy transition and climate change issues in and around Houston, in particular because of the impact of storms. And Houston is definitely seeing the impact of climate change much more so than a lot of other places. And so, Federico, talk a little bit about how your company is addressing some of those challenges and then some of the technologies that you're using to make a difference in circularity, energy efficiency, and food management.
Sure. It's ironic. That's the first I've heard of the NASA angle with Moji, but that's very cool. That's how I got my start too. In the early 90s, I was interning, and I was very interested in some work that was being done at Johnson Space Center on bioregenerative life support systems. And I learned a lot. They sent me over to Stennis Space Center in Mississippi, which was a 5-hour drive. And I learned a tremendous amount. That introduction was really what got me motivated into energy efficiency and sustainability. When I went back to Bayer, the next thing you know, I was building a greenhouse in a chemical plant, and people thought it was nuts. But we were using it to treat industrial wastewater, and it worked surprisingly well. That sort of launched my career, but during that time, it was very important. I mean, one of the things we learned was design really matters. And if you design these things just right, you don't have to use as much energy. You don't have to use as much resources to get the output. In fact, you can get greater output. So that was very interesting. But that's really what launched my career. And full circle, back then, they were killing the space program. And then in 2016, 2017, things got interesting. All of a sudden, hey, we're going to go moon, Mars, and they're bringing back the space program, SpaceX in particular, really driving the space exploration. So all of a sudden, bioregenerative technologies are getting more and more interesting. But our tagline is we use space-age technology to solve real-world problems. So we're looking at various different technologies that are out there, but in particular food. Not just vertical farming, but hydroponic farming in particular, and even more particular, hyper-local. You can't just waste 70% of what you're growing by shipping it constantly and throwing 70% of it away. It just doesn't make sense. If the demand is here, you have to find the solutions for where the demand is. So that's why we built our pilot and got that going. By the way, farming is just the key thing, but we're also doing a lot in solar and other technologies as well. But with hydroponic farming, the big niche that we found was like 80% of all fruits and vegetables come from south of the border, Mexico, Latin America, all U.S. produce. I mean, a tremendous amount is being transported thousands of miles away. And in California in particular, that's 1,200 miles just to go from Ohio, but several thousands of miles just to bring it to Houston. So when we got our pilot going and we started learning, COVID really impacted us negatively because all of our customers disappeared, but then the grocers started calling and they said, hey, our shipping costs are going high, our energy costs are too high, how do we get this going here in Houston? And Kroger reached out, and the next thing you know, we're expanding our facility to meet what Kroger used to be shipping 2,400-mile round trips are now disappeared. Now we do it for them, and so it's a big ESG message for them, but they were also surprised. So we've learned a lot, especially in Houston, with doing more with less. Heat is another issue, so we've come up with a very interesting coating that reflects heat from our greenhouses that we're patenting it. But we've just had to learn how to adapt and try to do as much as we could with less, but in particular with the food industry and hydroponics, I think you're gonna see more droughts, you're gonna see more climate events, you're gonna see more disruptions and supply chain issues, and it doesn't make sense that you produce something and you have to throw 70% away every day just because that's the only way you can get it to market. So those are our key focuses right now.
Those are great insights. If we think about sort of the vision for each of you for where you see your company, your technology, your solution 5 years out, 10 years out, you know, what's your vision for the role that you play in this transition? And then how does being in Houston and working with incumbent industry and some of the other players in that market and some of the other industries there, how does that factor into that vision for each of you? Moji, you want to get us started?
Sure. So within our company, we have a goal to utilize 1 gigaton of CO2 by 2050. And we actually have a quite, you know, we could do it. Like you could see, you know, if we build these plants in this timeline, it will happen. So that's more of on a quantified version. But more personally for me, I think if I'll have one contribution, just, you know, as another person in my life, it'll be to play a part in humans learning how to live in harmony with nature. And what I mean by that is to change our relationship from this kind of extracting, and then kind of dealing with the consequences to where we could build better systems that have that kind of circularity built into it. And, you know, especially when you think about all the waste streams, you know, because CO2 by itself is also a waste stream. And if you could utilize that, even though it's a very, very happy molecule, it's really hard to try to separate that carbon from the two oxygens, but there's ways to do it, you know, photosynthesis being one pathway that exists out there. And so that's kind of what we want to do. And then in terms of Houston, I think, you know, when we think about the future, sometimes it's like, you know, this certain scenario is going to happen. It doesn't work that way. Like we have to make it happen. So for example, if I want Houston to become also a biomanufacturing hub, which I think it has the potential to be, because we have the medical, we have all the chemical companies. Most of the current, you know, energy-intensive chemical reactions within the next 10, 20 years are going to be replaced one by one. Some by, you know, things like Trevor is working on with photocatalytic reactions, more efficient electrochemical reactions, and a lot of them are going to be replaced by biochemical reactions, as they have been. You know, for example, in the pharmaceutics industry, it's all biochemical reactions. It's more precise. It doesn't have emissions the same way you would. You have to run a, you know, chemical reaction in 1,000 degrees centigrade and 10,000 psi pressure. That's where you have a lot of this, you know, emissions in the scope 1, and you could reduce that. So it's the right place, you know. But it's like anything else. The city, I think, has done a great amount in showing the vision and the will to do this. And then, you know, on the entrepreneurs kind of on the ground, there is now more companies, there's more people. Even if before they were working at some of the big companies, you know, NASA and others are now becoming founders. So there is this new generation, you know, that is building this. So I think the timing would be exciting for a lot of those companies to grow and to become bigger companies in the next kind of 3 to 5 years and help with the bigger movement as well.
Awesome. Trevor?
Awesome. So where do we see ourselves going with this photocatalytic technology, and what's our vision? I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the science behind what we do. So it is nanotechnology based out of Rice University. The professors who are co-founders in the company, Professor Naomi Hollis and Professor Peter Nordlander, spent about 30 years researching this field of science called nanophotonics, as well as plasmonics. And what they've done is they've essentially made a near perfect light harvester. And so this is incredibly good at catching, photons and turning them into a form of energy that can be used. A couple years ago, they started decorating these with traditional catalysts. These are the same kind of catalysts that are used in industry today. So essentially, what we can do is take any industrial catalyst today and turn it into an ultra-high efficiency photocatalyst. This science wasn't really understood until very recently, and the implications for this and what it means for our species is enormous. For example, when they got one of their papers published in the journal Science, an independent third-party researcher took it upon themselves to publish why this was one of the most important works of science in the past couple decades. So really, I feel that it is our duty to get this technology into the market for the benefit of humanity. So we are truly stewards of this amazing new thing that's been discovered, and it's our duty to get it out there. So what getting it out there looks like, we've been scaling up since we found the technology in 2018. It was about, yay big. And down to the size I showed you all earlier, it's about a 500,000x scale up. We need to do one more jump of about 20 or 40x. We're in the process of designing that reactor now. Functionally, it is the exact same as that one, just a lot bigger. It'll be about the size of me. And then from there, you number up. You just, modular. You build a lot of them and put them together in parallel. So we will be designing that reactor this year. We will be deploying, one unit next year, 2024, start deploying banks of them. 2025, start doing like sizable projects, and 2026, 2027, start doing mega projects. Reactions we're targeting, as I mentioned, zero emission hydrogen is absolutely critical for energy infrastructure. It's a critical feedstock for utilizing CO2. It's critical for energy storage and just ultimately decarbonizing huge sectors of the economy. I also mentioned taking CO2 and turning it back into value-added products. This will allow us to tap into industrial processes that are producing a lot of CO2 that are difficult to abate, and take that CO2 and turn it into something that society can use, like synthetic fuels or methanol. Once you have methanol, that's a base for a lot of other chemical compounds, and ultimately we can sequester that CO2 into products. That will also start happening next year. Beyond that, we've got some foundational work on ammonia synthesis, which is fertilizer, which is how everyone eats, ethylene, which is plastic, which makes all of everything you see around you, as well as many like specialty chemicals that go further on down the value chain. So ultimately where we see this going is a complete disruption of the global chemical and energy infrastructure, with our technology playing a sizable role in that. We anticipate that that's really not going to come online till like the 2030s, but by 2050, through our pathway and some others, we absolutely see ways that humanity can achieve its goals of zero emissions and help to decarbonize this really, really difficult to abate sector. And one final note, just because this is very important and people love hyperbole, they like to think that only one thing's going to win, which thing's going to win. Our technology will win in a massive way, but we're still just talking, chunks of the market. Technologies like what Moji's doing is also going to take a chunk of the market. Like if you look at power generation now, wind, solar, hydro, nuclear, natural gas, like it takes this mix of many different things working together in different scenarios. The world's not a single use case, not one thing works everywhere. And, we don't believe in a silver bullet, but we believe that if we have enough silver buckshot, we might just get the job done. And our technology definitely plays a huge role in that, as do the others on this panel.
Awesome. Thanks, Trevor. Federico?
Yeah, with Moonflower Technologies, it's sort of ironic. Many years ago, when we first got started, and when I was learning at NASA all these different things that they're working on, they told me consistently that there's three things that human beings have absolutely no clue about, and they were learning this at NASA: what's in the food they eat, what's in the water they drink, or what's in the air they breathe. So Moonflower Technologies was really that's what got me started, and that's what I was trying to do at Bayer, and then later when I became an entrepreneur. Hey, let's focus on those key things. So, for example, at our farm, we know what's in the air we're breathing, we know what's in the food we're eating, and we know what's in the water that we're drinking. That technology is coming back. With us, we're envisioning, starting in Houston, but later going to other cities, creating the example of what sustainable city farming should be. We can't grow everything. We don't want to grow everything, but we can certainly set an example and have other interested schools or partners or farmers or groups that are saying, hey, we really like this. This is making a difference. We want to join your network. And then fine, that we'll help you do that. But we're not going to try to be the farmer for everything. We're mostly focused on the technology. And that way, everywhere we go to every major city, because every major city has this problem. They waste water like crazy. They waste energy like crazy. Food, 70% on average is discarded. So it's not a very good model. We're trying to change that model, but at the same time, we want people to know what's in the water they're drinking, what's in the food they're eating, and what's in the air they're breathing. So that's our primary mission, is be that leader in sustainable city farming, not be the farmer, but be the leader in how this should work. The other small little tidbit is we're still working very closely with NASA. We're doing some interesting things. And the name Moonflower actually came from my wife, because we're trying to help NASA put flowers in the moon. So just a little irony there. But yeah, that's our key focus right now.
That's fantastic. You know, one of the things I think that's common for all three of you is the role that the innovation ecosystem that's developing in Houston has played in helping to get things moving. You know, in Houston, we've launched the ION, we've launched the Greentown Labs, there's the Rice Alliance, there's Halliburton Labs, there's a pretty broad range of incubators in and around Houston now that are focused broadly on innovation and then also specifically on the energy transition. And so I'd be interested to hear from all three of you how that network, that ecosystem has helped each of you over the last, say, 2 years in developing your solutions and getting access to funding and progressing your dream.
Yeah, you want me to go first?
Yeah, sorry, yeah, Trevor, go ahead.
Got it. So, yeah, if you go back in time, we started, really understanding Syzygy and what we were working on back in 2017. You noted that I said the company started in 2018. Well, that first year, raising those first funds was a charming experience. And I remember the very first time I ever got up on stage and talked to anyone about the company was at Station Houston. And I just want to say what's up to Grace. Hey, how's it going? Station was a really fantastic place, and I can say with complete confidence, without organizations like that, we'd be dead. Because, me talk pretty now, but it wasn't back then. I used to get up on stage and be like, we've got a plasmonic photocatalyst that excites the, electron transfer and certain types of plasmonic nanoparticles, and nobody cared. And organizations like Station, helped me craft my pitch, introduced me to mentors, and over time, we've seen this really start to blossom in Houston. As Jane mentioned, Station transitioned to the ION, Greentown Labs opened up here, and there is just this wave of innovation starting to blossom in Houston. And without these things, it's really, really hard to get off the ground, because this is a very different kind of game. It's not something that you can really go I know you can take a class in college, but it doesn't do it justice, the kind of support that the accelerators and the incubators provide. And so, without those, I don't know if we would have made it. And It's been amazing to watch because we're also involved in the Boston ecosystem a lot. We're an engine portfolio company, so we work with Greentown in Boston, we work at the engine in Boston, and we're seeing a lot of cross-pollination between the ecosystems. And what's truly amazing though is Houston has, as we talked about, like why Houston's awesome. Houston has things that those other ecosystems don't, and it's starting to really come into its own. And you're seeing a lot more like climate tech-oriented companies and other things popping up in Houston with a little bit more of an edge that some of the other ecosystems in the country don't quite have.
Thank you. So I think, about the same experience as Trevor. The only thing I would add is, what's happening right now, the reason that this is resonating and it's really exciting is because we have the best engineers in Houston. I mean, that's just a fact. And that's just because of the legacy of the oil and gas industry, process engineering, NASA. In the early days of kind of Houston innovation, there was actually a lot of focus on just like software, and like Silicon Bayou was a thing. That just didn't work. And now that we have, companies like ours and others coming into the space with people who come from that background, who understand the industries that are in Houston, you see out of a sudden everything just makes sense, and we're just going to do a lot more of it. The other thing about the Houston entrepreneurs, I think is important is because Houston, we're building up, but we're not like Silicon Valley or like the East Coast. So we don't have this like super mature like VC ecosystem and things like that. Because of that, the entrepreneurs that you see kind of have survived, and post kind of their seed round or Series A, they have gone through a bunch of stuff. So they're more gritty. That's what I'm saying, and they're more resourceful. And if anyone who has built a companies know that's like the most important thing. And so from here on, hopefully the new entrepreneurs will have an easier time, and I know they will in Houston ecosystem, access to funding, building their first prototype. I think Greentown moving to Houston was a big signal as well for climate tech, and then for us also in terms of the biotech because of the Boston connection. There's other things too that maybe our company had more exposure to. For example, J Labs. If you know about J Labs, Johnson & Johnson Innovation Lab within the Texas Medical Center, and then within the Texas Medical Center, there's this thing called TMCX. They have 2 cohorts every year, one for digital healthcare, one for biomedical devices. And so all of that is happening in Houston, and these entrepreneurs kind of meet each other, start new companies, and it's very multidisciplinary, which is another thing that is really exciting. And because, climate tech, energy transition is all very multidisciplinary. Everyone just has to go outside of their comfort zone, learn about different parts of the supply chain. So Houston provides a good foundation for exploring that. And then, a lot of companies, basically the ideas would just happen that way and built from there.
Yeah, I totally agree with everything they've said, and it's kind of ironic. When I left Bayer in 2007, moved to Houston, a lot of my colleagues are like, why don't you go to Austin, or why don't you go to California? You're doing all these weird green businesses, and that's probably, you're gonna have better. At the time, my wife was a marine engineer, so the closest ocean was near Houston. So it was one of the driving factors. But since then, the climate in Houston has really accelerated, and especially with entrepreneurs and VCs and all that. I agree with Moji. It was very difficult to get funding for any idea, and that's why they would push you to other regions of the U.S. But now with Greentown Labs in particular and the ION, this last networking event that I went to at the ION last Friday, I had over 200 people there for like hours, and I was like, oh my gosh. You didn't see that about 10 years ago. Now you're seeing it like every week. So the access to resources and innovation and ideas, it's a really good melting pot of what's going on. But yeah, right now with Houston, a lot is definitely developing very quickly. And I think the VCs and a lot of these other funds are taking notice because we're seeing a lot more of them showing up at these networking events. So it's a pretty exciting time, and it's definitely for us, we've had 3 term sheets in the last year, so I'd say we've done pretty well. We didn't have any for like several years, and all of a sudden activity really started picking up.
Thanks. So I'm going to open it up to questions in a few minutes, and I just want to let you guys know we've got a microphone here and then a microphone at the back of the room. So if you've got questions, we would like to ask you to line up there. But the last question I wanted to ask is around, not sort of in pitch mode, but if you're talking to VC firms, what is it that you want them to know about why they should be in Houston and what's happening there? And Moji, I'll start with you.
I mean, I think at this point it's pretty obvious. I mean, Larry Fink has said it, Bill Gates has said it. A lot of the future kind of, multi-billion, multi-X unicorns will come from energy transition. And if you think about, well, where would they come from? Well, it's where they're gonna have more traction, and it's where they're gonna have more customers and gonna have more support. And I think Houston is building up to provide that foundation for companies. So that's if I was a VC, that's why I'll be interested, in looking kind of what's going on there and be more involved. And some are already, like some VC firms that for years, they were not really paying attention. I see them at events, flying in from East Coast, West Coast, and kind of see what's going on. Because if any VC now has a carbon, climate tech or carbon tech something, right? And Houston is where the customers are there in terms of the, especially on the B2B side. So that's why I would look there if I was a VC. It's just logical.
Awesome. Federico?
Yeah, no, I agree. The customers are definitely in Houston, but for us in particular, and if I were to talk to VC, there's a lot of demand there for change, a lot of demand for a lot of this green technology and what it can do. We've had enormous interest from the education sector, and we've been told, in the past there was a saying that as California goes, so does the rest of the country eventually. But in Houston, it's like as Houston goes, so does the rest of the country go as far as food, as far as climate, energy, and education. So that's a really good breeding ground for testing and really sort of making sure that the technology you're using and the work that you're doing is making an impact, because it does get a lot of attention that usually opens the doors to national markets. And that's exactly what we're seeing right now. So for a VC, I would say, yeah, look at what we're doing. And by the way, look who's calling from California and from New York and from elsewhere, because those are the phone calls that we're getting right now.
Trevor?
Yeah, and so to cap it all off, 3 reasons why, if you're investing, you should be paying attention to Houston. Number 1 is the talent. Not only from like a leadership team standpoint, but also just the kind of teams that get built there. The talent in Houston is really unprecedented. Talking about like the availability to source like engineers and different professionals, related to energy, food, biomedical. It's really a hub that has a level of talent that's not really present anywhere else in the U.S. And next, obviously just to back up what they said, customer base. So many companies, and I love them, we're friends with them, based out of Silicon Valley and based out of Boston. When they grow up, they move to Houston. And us having been started there just really gives us a leg up. And so like now as they're growing up, they're calling us and asking us like, hey, can we get intros to this customer? Can we get, where's a good place to build a facility? Where do you get things manufactured? Give you an example on that. Like we're giving, 1 or 2 lab tours a day right now. And it's just because these people can like drive in from downtown and see it as opposed to have to fly across the US. And then finally, capital efficiency. Just $1 in Houston goes much, much further than $1 in Silicon Valley or $1 in Boston or even $1 in Austin. Love Austin, but Houston has a really incredible, real estate market where you can get, buildings to scale your company, at a really good rates. Things aren't super expensive there. And so we are doing easily 2 or 3 times as much with the amount of money that we have as companies that aren't based in Houston. And it is providing us with like a huge advantage in terms of our ability to scale quicker and really accelerate the organization. So yeah, why you should be paying attention to Houston: talent, customers, and capital efficiency.
Thanks, guys. As the executive director of the Houston Energy Transition Initiative, it's been really amazing for the past couple months to see how much activity there is happening in and around Houston. And our vision is to leverage Houston's leadership in energy to continue to be the energy capital of the world in a low carbon future. And so it's going to be through folks like these that are bringing real solutions to the table that can really make an impactful difference to the energy transition as we move forward. And with that, I want to open up to questions.
Hi, my name is Cameron Roots. I am a PhD candidate here at UT Austin in the synthetic biology space. One of my skepticisms is actually for you, Trevor. Synthetic biology is excellent, but I have a question on hydrogen production. So one of my reservations is the source of where you're getting your hydrogen. I know there's an appeal to mine hydrocarbons, rip their hydrogens, and introduce them into the carbon cycle. And so I was wondering if your source of hydrogen is already in the carbon cycle and what's happening to any carbon byproducts, if you're even using carbon as a substrate.
Yeah, fantastic question. And so first off, I'd like to note that we have a platform technology. We actually have 4 separate pathways that yield hydrogen. 2 are a little bit more esoteric, so we're going to bury those for right now. The other 2, the feedstocks we're using are methane, which has a carbon atom attached to it, and also ammonia, which has no carbon atom. So if you're using renewable ammonia, then you're using that as a hydrogen carrier, you transport it to where our equipment's located, you disassociate it, you get the hydrogen back out. Incredibly interesting for Japan, Korea, because they're importing energy as they want to get off, a carbon-based energy carrier like LNG. This gives them a fantastic pathway and lets them get all the benefits of using hydrogen that other economies have. Also very interesting for Europe. For the methane-based pathway, you still have that carbon atom attached. And even though you eliminate the combustion using our reactor and get a phenomenal drop in your carbon intensity, you still have to deal with that carbon atom. And this is exactly why we started to research our CO2 consuming reactions. So what we're working on is combining the 2. And so as I noted, we'll also be going to market with a CO2 to value reaction next year. Target is methanol or synthetic fuels. And so the idea is you take that carbon and you turn it into something else. And to finally kind of put the last cherry on top, the most important part of this entire conversation is actually what I think is going to be the most exciting thing in the next decade, and it has nothing to do with science and technology and everything to do with human beings. And the most exciting thing that's going to happen is actually accounting, believe it or not. Carbon accounting is like the Wild West right now, and different governmental regimes have different frameworks for doing what's called life cycle assessment. So if you go calculate your carbon intensity per the United States GREET model, it looks one way. If you calculate it per the European Certif High program, it looks completely different. And if you calculate it per the International Panel on Climate Change numbers, it looks very different. I don't really care. I'm not strongly for or against one pathway or another. What I am against is emissions going into the atmosphere. So regardless of what feedstock we use, we have to make sure that it has a very low carbon intensity. For example, you can make hydrogen from water, but if you're getting your electricity from the wrong source to power that process, it is not very clean at all. And some things that are branded as green and regulated as green don't necessarily have the best carbon intensity, depending on what framework you look at them. Some things that look great under the American framework don't look so great under the International Panel on Climate Change numbers. And so we got to bring all that together, and we have to preferentially select the pathways that reduce the carbon intensity to the lowest possible number without completely destroying the economics. I hope I answered your question.
No, you did, especially with the ammonia. Super exciting. Thank you.
Thanks.
First of all, this was absolutely fascinating. Thank you all so much for coming out. I'm 19. I'm an aerospace engineering major at UT Austin, And I guess this is kind of for, whoever wants to jump in and answer, but what are the best things that I can do right now to sort of prepare myself like upon my graduation for like participating in this like energy transformation?
Well, it sounds like you're already started. You're here. No, really, there's a lot of activity going on, both in Austin and in Houston in this area, and really just reaching out. I mean, you can reach out to me or anyone on this panel. I'm sure we'll send you some contacts. And all of a sudden, that networking opens some doors, and then there might be something of interest that really that you're fascinated by. It could be working at NASA. It could be doing something else as far as the synthetic energy pathways that are going on. So absolutely, that's what I would recommend, is to start. The fact that you're reaching out is a good thing, and in my experience, I've learned it never hurts to ask. It just reach out. On LinkedIn, I got a term sheet because I was just I was so frustrated. I was going nowhere with this development that we were doing, and after a year, I'm like, I'm giving up. This is not going to work. And I just looked up something on LinkedIn, and the next thing you know, I made a phone call. Then they introduced me to somebody who introduced me to our first client. It was just like, it happened in 3 months. So the fact that you're reaching out is a very good thing.
One of the things that we're doing at the partnership is creating the connectivity between the 4 big research universities in Texas and Greentown Labs. And so I would highly recommend that you connect in with the Energy Club at UT Austin, because they have been connecting in with us about how to help create that pipeline of innovation and idea development into the ecosystem that we're creating in Houston, so that there's an opportunity. So we've been talking with a number of the different universities about how to create that connectivity. And I think for the moment, your energy clubs are probably the best resource for you to figure out how to get a bit more engaged in that community.
Thank y'all so much.
Hi, my name is Vanessa Ramirez. I'm a journalist and not an energy expert, but I have kind of a general question for any of you who would want to answer it. So we're in this place where there's a big push to transition to renewables and exit coal, but there's also some concerns, and I've just been reading a lot about how we might be in too much of a hurry to, for example, shut down coal plants that aren't actually at the end of their usable life yet, before there are sufficient replacement sources to produce the same amount of power from renewables. So I'm curious what you all think about whether we're being realistic about the timing of the energy transition, and also how it's going to happen, and maybe how any of the projects you're working on might play a role in that.
I could maybe start. So you're absolutely right, and I think some of the recent kind of events really prove that too. That we pretty much have a very delicate supply chain, and as much as we all would want to, have everything happen quickly, but it won't. So I think, I think of energy transition more of a energy transformation. So throughout time, you need to slowly ramp down the use of fossil fuels and then ramp up, the use of renewables. Now, there's 2 scenarios that most people really spend time on. One is solving the emission problem for fossil fuels. So that's the CCUS pathway, carbon capture, utilization, and storage. If you could continue to use fossil fuels, but capture the emissions so that at the end it's no emissions. The other one is replacing where fossil fuel was used in the first place. So if it's with the use of hydrogen, ammonia in some cases, whatever the people were using, methane or fossil fuels, replacing that. Now, in terms of the electricity, again, a lot of the energy transition technologies are going to need electricity. So where's that going to come from? And do we have enough renewables today to provide that? That's why you see nuclear is now back on the table, and people are really excited about it, because isn't that the ultimate way to produce zero emission electricity? I think we could do it by 2050, but I think there is we need more dialogue, and I think it's starting to happen now, because before, I used to be an oil and gas person in Houston. Didn't have much in common with environmentalists in California. But now we're having a dialogue and thinking about, wait, this is all energy tech. It's not clean tech or dirty tech. for all of this, like Trevor said, you just have to do the life cycle assessment. And there's many examples where that's been defined incorrectly and people just kind of hang on to it. For example, you have biofuels or something like bioethanol. If it's made, from sugar in Brazil, they call it bio something. Well, maybe, but you have to look at what was the emissions for the land, the fertilizer use, transformation, waiting 6 months, as opposed to processes where the process is bio, not necessarily the feedstock. That could still be called bio, the same product, right? And all of that is kind of transforming right now. I think we could do it by 2050, but it does require a lot more holistic dialogue.
I think the other point I'd add is that I think there's a tendency to think about the energy transition as a 1x problem when we should be thinking about it as a 2x or more problem. The amount of energy needed 20, 30 years from now will be more than twice the amount of energy used today. So we need to be figuring out the solutions for the energy the world will need 20 years from now, 30 years from now, which is a very different question than the amount of energy that's being used today. And so I think that's where we really start to understand that we have to have all of the above solutions. We have to address the emissions created today through the energy systems that we have, while at the same time figuring out what the energy technologies of the future will be that will allow us to take a different pathway.
And I'll chime in real quick because I spent many years at Bayer when I was working there, and the biggest impact we had was not finding cheaper, more abundant sources of energy. It was being more efficient. Our best use of funds was, hey, these motors use half as much energy. Wow, I don't need to buy more. We changed our processes so they use much less energy. I mean, when I was there, some of the projects we did. So in my experience, energy efficiency is really the key. Energy abundance is one thing, and you can have abundant fission or fusion, but really it's energy efficiency is the key.
I want to make sure we get to the one last question that we
Thank you.
before we run out of time.
Yes.
Thank you. I'm Catherine Boudreau. I'm a sustainability reporter with Politico. And I had a question just touching on what you said, Trevor, about how, there's some things that are labeled, some technologies, energy or agriculture, name the industry, that are labeled green, but aren't. So I'm hoping you can get specific about that. Maybe you have some examples that you can share. Because as a journalist, I'm always trying to figure that out. And also, will the new reactor you're developing maybe change some of the things that are not really green become green? Thank you.
So, fantastic question. The root of that statement comes from the International Panel on Climate Change Working Group number 3 and their assessment of life cycle carbon emissions from different electricity production pathways. This was last published in 2014. They should be updating this and publishing new numbers later this year. So everything I'm about to say, pending new publication, trust their PhDs, not me. But in the International Panel on Climate Change Working Group number 3, electricity production pathways, you start to see some things. So like solar is not 100% carbon free. You have to take into account the embodied emissions, the emissions that are generated during the production of the solar panels. Same with wind, same with electricity from biomass. All of these renewable pathways are better than coal or better than just burning natural gas, but they aren't zero. So if you then go look at like energy transition and knock-on effects, if you are powering a process with some kind of electricity, solar, wind, hydro, nuclear, it's different depending on where that electricity is coming from. So let's look at like electrolysis, which is green hydrogen production. If you're powering it with solar, it's got one carbon intensity. If you're powering it with wind, it's got another. A lot of people don't know that solar has about 5 times the carbon intensity of wind. Just within solar, the lowest carbon, across the life cycle, solar panels have 10 times lower carbon intensity than the highest carbon pathway, which is, solar panels produced using coal power in China. And biomass pathways where you are burning biomass to create electricity are about 20 times higher carbon intensity than like wind, for example. And so the knock-on effects of like powering an electrolyzer with those different pathways is pretty big, where if you're making it with wind power, it is phenomenally low carbon intensity. We should be supporting that. Government should be subsidizing that like times 100. Let's do it. But if you're powering it from biomass, it's actually on a life cycle basis not any better than gray. And gray hydrogen just gets disparaged. People spit at it, and green gets celebrated. But depending on where that green electron came from, you know, one might not actually be better than the other. This is really important because...
Thanks, Trevor. Sorry.
Sorry.
They're giving me the
that's my favorite
cuts, huh?
question. Happy to talk more about it.
Thanks, everybody, for being here. Great panel. Thanks.
Thank you.